History is often written by the victors, but it is just as often rewritten by the resentful. Few figures have been the subject of more scandalous revisionism than the woman who would become Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia. The stories whispered about her, particularly about the end of her life, are lurid, grotesque, and designed to shock. They speak of unspeakable acts, of a death so depraved it almost defies imagination. The most infamous of these tales involves an intimate encounter with a horse, a slander so potent it has clung to her name for centuries, overshadowing the legacy of a 34-year reign that transformed Russia into a global power. But this story, this stain upon her memory, is a complete fabrication, a lie born from the fear and misogyny of her enemies, designed to reduce a titan of the 18th century to a caricature of female depravity. The truth of Catherine's death is mundane. She suffered a stroke in her dressing room and died peacefully in her bed the next day. The truth of her life, however, was anything but mundane. It was a saga of ambition, intellect, betrayal, and power. And yes, it was a life filled with love, passion, and a succession of lovers, so numerous they became a political institution in their own right. She did not die in a stable, but she did live with a voracious appetite, not just for physical affection, but for life, for knowledge, and for absolute power. To understand the empress who took so many lovers, we must first understand the lonely German princess, who arrived in Russia with nothing but a dream. A girl named Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt Zerbst. She was born in 1729 in Stettin, Prussia, into the obscurity of minor German nobility. Her father was a prince of a tiny, insignificant territory, and her mother was a well-connected but notoriously cold and difficult woman. Sophie was not considered a beauty. She was sharp, inquisitive, and fiercely intelligent. Qualities not particularly valued in a prospective royal bride. Her ticket out of this provincial life was a summons from the most powerful woman in the world at the time, Empress Elizabeth of Russia. Elizabeth was looking for a wife for her nephew and chosen heir, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. Sophie, with her German blood and convenient lack of threatening political alliances, seemed a suitable, pliable candidate. At just 14 years old, she embarked on the arduous journey to a cold, foreign land, a world of unimaginable wealth, Byzantine court politics, and brutal power plays. She knew her mission was simple: produce a male heir and secure her position. To do this, she reinvented herself. She shed the name Sophie and was christened into the Russian Orthodox faith as Ekaterina, or Catherine. She threw herself into learning the Russian language, practicing so relentlessly late at night that she contracted pneumonia, nearly dying. But this act of dedication endeared her to the Russian people and to the Empress. She understood, with a prescient wisdom far beyond her years, that to survive in this court she had to become more Russian than the Russians. Her intended husband, the Grand Duke Peter, was a disaster. He was childish, cruel, and deeply neurotic. He hated Russia, openly praised its enemy, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and spent his days playing with toy soldiers and tormenting his servants. He showed his young wife no affection, only contempt. Their wedding night, as Catherine would later recall in her memoirs, was a portrait of humiliation. Peter got drunk with his valets and collapsed into bed, ignoring her completely. The marriage remained unconsummated for years. Catherine found herself trapped. She was the Grand Duchess, the future Empress, yet she was isolated, unloved, and politically powerless. Her husband reviled her. Her mother-in-law, the Empress, watched her with suspicion, and the courtiers saw her as a foreign pawn. In these long, lonely years, she turned to books. She devoured the works of the Enlightenment: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot. She educated herself in philosophy, law, and history, forging an intellect that would one day rival any monarch in Europe. She was building the foundations of a ruler while living the life of a prisoner. but a young, intelligent and neglected woman in a court, simmering with intrigue, will not remain a wallflower for long. The court was a hotbed of sensuality, a place where Empress Elizabeth herself had set the tone with her own string of favorites. Love and politics were inextricably linked. An affair was not just a matter of the heart, it was a strategic alliance. After nearly a decade of a barren and loveless marriage, Catherine, with the likely encouragement of her frustrated courtiers who desperately needed an heir, finally took a lover. His name was Sergei Saltykov, a handsome and charming chamberlain. He was witty, dashing, and everything her husband was not. Their affair was brief and clandestine, but it was a profound turning point. It awakened her to her own desires and her own agency, and in 1754 she finally gave birth to a son, Paul. The parentage of Paul has been a subject of historical debate ever since. Was he Peter's son, conceived after a court doctor supposedly corrected a physical issue, or was he Saltykov's, the product of Catherine's first foray into infidelity? Catherine herself remained coyly ambiguous. When questioned, she once quipped, "The one certain thing is that to know who the father of a child is, one must have been the mother." What mattered was that an heir existed. Yet Peter publicly cast doubt on the boy's legitimacy, further alienating Catherine. Her affair with Saltykov ended when he was sent away on a diplomatic mission, a common way of disposing of inconvenient lovers at the Russian court. But Catherine had crossed a threshold. She would never again be the passive, obedient wife. She had learned that she could seek comfort, affection, and pleasure outside the suffocating confines of her marriage. Her next significant affair was with Stanisław Poniatowski, a suave Polish aristocrat and diplomat. Theirs was a more refined, romantic connection. They shared a love of art and literature, and for a time she was deeply in love. This relationship further honed her political skills as she navigated the dangerous waters of a public secret. But it was all a prelude. In 1761, the formidable Empress Elizabeth died, and Catherine's nightmare became a reality. Her husband ascended the throne as Emperor Peter III. His 6-month reign was a whirlwind of catastrophic decisions. He immediately made peace with Russia's arch enemy, Prussia, insulting the army that had sacrificed so much to defeat them. He alienated the powerful Orthodox Church with his Lutheran sympathies and threatened to confiscate their lands. He was erratic, abusive, and openly spoke of divorcing Catherine, imprisoning her in a convent, and marrying his mistress. For Catherine, this was not just a political crisis, it was a mortal threat. She knew that the moment he divorced her, her life, and potentially the life of her son Paul, would be forfeit. Survival demanded action. And for that, she needed more than a romantic diplomat. She needed a soldier. She found him in Grigory Orlov. Grigory and his 4 brothers were titans of the Imperial Guard, the powerful military regiments stationed in St. Petersburg, who had a long history of deciding who sat on the Russian throne. Grigory was everything Peter was not: charismatic, brave, physically powerful, and quintessentially Russian. He was a man of action, not of ideas. Their affair was passionate, explosive, and perfectly timed. He and Catherine became the heart of a conspiracy. While Peter was away at one of his palaces, drilling his personal Holstein troops, Catherine, with the backing of the Orlov brothers and their loyal guardsmen, made her move. In the early morning hours of the 28th of June, 1762, Catherine, dressed in the uniform of an officer of the Preobrazhensky Guard, rode at the head of the troops into St. Petersburg. She was declared the sole ruler, the Empress, by the cheering soldiers and the acquiescing church. It was a remarkably bloodless coup. Peter, upon hearing the news, collapsed into indecision and despair. He abdicated without a fight. Just over a week later, he was dead. The official cause was a severe colic attack, but few believed it. He was almost certainly murdered by Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, during a drunken brawl at the estate where he was being held. Whether Catherine ordered the assassination or simply accepted its political necessity remains one of the great unanswered questions of her reign. She expressed public shock and grief, but his death was undeniably convenient. It removed the final obstacle to her absolute power. At the age of 33, the German Princess Sophie had become Catherine II, autocrat of all the Russias. Her throne was secured with the help of her lover. It was a lesson she would never forget. Grigory Orlov was now the man behind the throne. He was showered with titles, wealth, and land. He was a constant presence by her side, the father of her illegitimate son, Alexei Bobrinsky. For a decade, their relationship defined the early years of her reign. He was her protector, her confidant, her passionate companion. The court buzzed with the expectation that she would marry him, making him her prince consort. Catherine, however, was a pragmatist. She knew her power was still precarious. She was a foreign usurper with a dead husband and a living, legitimate heir in her son Paul. Marrying Orlov, a mere subject, would have been a political earthquake. It would have alienated the old nobility and undermined her own authority. Her powerful advisor, Nikita Panin, bluntly told her that the Russian people might tolerate an empress, but they would never tolerate a Madame Orlov, so she kept him as her favorite. A position that was official in all but name, but the seeds of their separation were sown in their very natures. Orlov was a soldier, not a statesman. While Catherine was drafting legal codes, corresponding with Voltaire, and managing the complexities of her vast empire, he grew bored. He was uneducated, impulsive, and notoriously unfaithful. His public affairs were a constant source of humiliation for the empress. The passion that had brought them together began to curdle into frustration. Catherine needed an intellectual partner, a man who could share the immense burden of rule. Orlov could command a regiment, but he couldn't help her govern an empire. The final break came while he was away negotiating a treaty after a successful war against the Ottoman Empire. In his absence, Catherine's eye and her political calculus turned elsewhere. She dismissed him, as she would all her future lovers, with staggering generosity. He received a palace, a fortune, and a pension, effectively buying his quiet retirement. The Orlov era was over. His departure marked a crucial evolution in Catherine's approach to her relationships. She had learned that passion alone was not enough. She needed something more. And so the system began to formalize. Being the Empress's favorite became the most coveted and lucrative position in the Russian Empire. It was not a sordid secret, but a recognized institution, a candidate. Usually a young, handsome officer from the Guards would be identified. He would be vetted by Catherine's trusted advisors and, according to court gossip, sometimes even tested for his physical abilities by her lady-in-waiting Countess Praskovia Bruce, who earned the nickname Lei Fay Pruvius's Fay. The tester, if the candidate passed muster, he would be invited to Catherine's private apartments. If the night was a success, the next morning he would find a fortune, perhaps 100,000 rubles, and an official appointment on his bedside table. He would be installed in a suite of rooms directly below the Empress's, connected by a private staircase. He became the general aide-de camp, accompanying her everywhere, dining with her, and sharing her bed. For as long as he held her favor, his power was immense. He could influence appointments, dispense patronage, and accumulate wealth beyond imagining. But the position was precarious. It depended entirely on the Empress's affection and his own discretion. When she tired of him, or he became arrogant or unfaithful, the end was swift. He would be politely dismissed, sent on a tour of Europe or to a country estate, always cushioned by a golden parachute of land, serfs, and money. It was a gilded cage, a high-stakes game of romance and politics between Orlov's departure and the arrival of her next great love. There was a brief succession of these favorites. Men like Alexander Vasilchikov, who was handsome and placid, but so dull that Catherine complained he was like a well-bred calf. They were placeholders filling a role while the Empress searched for something more profound. Then, in 1774, a man from her past re-entered her life and changed everything. His name was Grigory Potemkin. Potemkin was a force of nature. He was wildly ambitious, brilliant, and eccentric. He was a soldier, a statesman, a poet, and a mystic all rolled into one. He was tall and imposing, though he had lost an eye in a duel, a fact that only added to his mystique. He had been one of the minor conspirators in her 1762 coup, one of the many young officers who had helped bring her to power. Now, he returned to court, a decorated war hero. The connection between them was immediate and electric. It was a meeting of minds as much as bodies. He was not just her physical equal, he was her intellectual peer. He could debate philosophy with her one moment and plan a military campaign the next. He shared her vision for Russia's greatness, for its expansion south to the Black Sea. He was her colossal child, her golden pheasant, her twin soul. Their correspondence, thousands of letters that survive to this day, reveals a relationship of breathtaking passion, intimacy, and intellectual partnership. They called each other husband and wife, leading many historians to believe they were secretly married. Whether a formal ceremony took place or not is irrelevant in every way that mattered. He was her consort. For 2 years, from 1774 to 1776, they were inseparable. Potemkin was made a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, a field marshal and the most powerful man in Russia. He wasn't just a favorite, he was a caruler. He oversaw the military, foreign policy, and the ambitious project of colonizing the newly conquered southern territories, a region that became known as Novorossiya, or New Russia. But even a love this grand was not built to last in the crucible of absolute power. The intensity that drew them together also created friction. They were two brilliant, temperamental suns in a single orbit. Their arguments were as legendary as their passion. Eventually, the physical side of their relationship cooled. By 1776, their romance was over. But what happened next is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Catherine's story. Their love did not sour into rivalry or hatred. It transformed into a deep, enduring, and powerful friendship. Potemkin moved out of the palace apartments, but not out of her life. He remained her most trusted advisor, her closest confidant, and her political partner until his death. And, in an arrangement that seems almost unbelievable, he took on the role of vetting and even recommending her future lovers. Their partnership had evolved beyond the bedroom. He understood her needs for companionship, for affection, and for a presentable male escort at court. He ensured that the men who filled the role of favorite were loyal, competent, and, most importantly, not a threat to his own unique and unassailable position. He would present a slate of handsome young officers, and Catherine would make her choice. This began the final, longest phase of Catherine's romantic life. Over the next 15 years, a series of young men passed through the favorite's apartments. There was the beautiful and gentle Pyotr Zavadovsky, who was followed by the dashing Semyon Zorik. When Zorik proved too much of a gambler, he was replaced by the polished Ivan Rimsky. Kosakov, whose stunning singing voice captivated the Empress until he foolishly had an affair with Catherine's tester. Countess Bruce, resulting in the dismissal of them both. The list goes on. There were about 12 officially recognized favorites in total after Potemkin. Though popular legend has inflated the number to 22 or more, these men were, for the most part, politically insignificant. They were decorative, companions who filled a void. Catherine was now in her 50s and 60s, a powerful, established ruler. She no longer needed a partner in her bed to secure her throne. Perhaps she simply enjoyed the company of handsome, adoring young men. She was generous to a fault with them, lavishing them with wealth. The total cost of her favorites over her 34-year reign is estimated to have been over 90 million rubles, an astronomical sum enough to fund a small war. But to Catherine, It was perhaps a necessary expense of the state, the cost of maintaining stability and personal contentment in a life of immense pressure. The system, overseen by the ever-watchful Potemkin, worked. It prevented the rise of a new Orlov or a rival to Potemkin himself. It kept the court's power dynamics stable and centered firmly on Catherine. The only man who ever truly mattered was Potemkin. His death in 1791 on the barren steppes of Bessarabia devastated her. When she received the news, she collapsed, crying, "Who can I rely on now?" She had lost her student, her friend, her idol. The light of her reign seemed to dim. Without Potemkin's steadying hand, her judgment in her final years seemed to falter. Her last favorite, Platon Zubov, was more than 40 years her junior. Unlike his predecessors, he was ambitious and meddled in state affairs, often with disastrous results. Some saw him as a sign of the empress's senility, a final, foolish infatuation. Others saw a lonely, aging woman seeking one last echo of the passion that had defined her youth. Catherine the Great died in 1796 at the age of 67. Having ruled Russia for 34 years, she left behind a radically transformed empire. She had expanded its borders, reformed its laws, and championed the arts and sciences. She was, by any measure, one of the most successful rulers of her century, and yet the focus, both during her life and after, so often returns to her bedchamber. Why? The answer is twofold. First, her sexuality was a weapon used against her from the very beginning. Her enemies, foreign and domestic, used her succession of lovers to paint her as decadent, unstable, and morally unfit to rule. It was a way to delegitimize a woman who had seized power in a man's world. The lurid stories, culminating in the disgusting myth about the horse, were political propaganda, plain and simple. They were designed to eclipse her achievements with scandal. The second reason is a persistent double standard. Male monarchs of the era, like Louis XIV of France with his parade of official mistresses, or Charles II of England, are often remembered for their virility. Their affairs are footnotes to their reigns, evidence of their power and charisma. But for Catherine, a woman who dared to wield power like a man and to love like a man, her personal life became her defining feature. She refused to be a chaste widow or to remarry and subordinate herself to a husband. She created a unique solution, a system that fulfilled her personal needs while serving her political ends. She took lovers on her own terms, controlled their rise and managed their fall. Each relationship was a reflection of her evolving needs as a woman and a ruler. Sergei Saltykov was the key that unlocked her from a sterile marriage. Stanis Maritoski was the romance of her youth. Grigory Orlov was the passionate soldier she needed to win a throne, and Grigory Potemkin was the soulmate she needed to help her rule an empire. The men who followed were echoes of these greater loves, companions for an empress who stood alone at the pinnacle of power. To label her simply as promiscuous is to accept the narrative of her enemies. It is to miss the point entirely. Catherine's relationships were not a sign of weakness. They were a testament to her strength. They were a tool of statecraft, a source of stability, and an expression of a woman who, having been denied love and respect in her youth, spent the rest of her life commanding it in her empire and in her heart. She was not the depraved creature of myth. She was a woman of immense appetites for knowledge, art, power, and passion. She was an empress, an intellectual, a conqueror, and a lover. She was, in all her glorious complexity, Catherine the Great.